So welcome everyone to Bible and Brew. Today we're going to be reading John chapter 13. And yeah, this is like the, I said last week, it's like the soap opera, so let's enjoy it.
Well, just a quick story before we get in. Those of you who were here last week will remember that when we read the text, did I not tell you, if you believe, you would see the power of God, the glory of God? And I told how that saying of Jesus is actually important to all of Christian life, and that I really try to lean into it, and that I shared a very particular thing I was trying to believe God for, namely a friend of mine whose business was going to pot because he didn't have any business. It's a construction business. He'd had to let go of everybody, and his wife had emailed me and said, "Hey, it's desperate. Pray that Dave gets some business, or else he's going to have to go out of business." So at any rate, we prayed, and 3 days later, Friday morning, I get the email back from her. Maybe it was Saturday, saying, "Guess what? He got a really big job." And it enables him to hire people back and to sort of get the whole thing going. And I know it's really tremendously important to him. So it was just a little like prayer works. And I had another one that happened the same day, or the next day, which is a friend, Ibrahim, who may be coming here tonight, was stuck with a job he had been accepted for, but there was a holdup with HR stuff. And we prayed, and there was just some kind of breakthrough, and he started the following last Monday. So, at any rate, some little answers to prayer and expressions of it makes a difference when we believe. Okay. Well, now we're starting the second part of the Gospel of John. The first part is often called the Book of Signs. Well, the second part is called the Book of Glory. I don't know that the author wrote them in two books or thought on them that much, but there is definitely a theme. The first part is focused around the signs of Jesus that lead people to an encounter with him that leads them to faith. While on the other hand, the second part is about Jesus' glorification. You know, the chapter that precedes it, the last chapter of the first part, says, "Father, glorify your Son." And now Jesus is going to enter into his glory, but his glory is his crucifixion and then his resurrection and his ascension. So that's his glory. So now we get into the first part of that text, in which Jesus does a kind of prophetic gesture that symbolizes all that he's about to do. And the disciples don't get it. You know, the prophets in the Old Testament used to do these gestures to kind of act out something that God was going to do, or something that was part of God's plan, or to reveal a message. And that's essentially what Jesus is doing with what he does here in the very first part of the chapter. So I'm just going to turn it over to Jose to read.
Now before the feast of Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, when the devil had already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with a towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, do you wash my feet?" Jesus answered him, "What I am doing you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand." Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "The one who has bathed does not need to wash, except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not every one of you." For he knew who was to betray him. That was why he said, "Not all of you are clean."
So the first indication of what's going on here is it says, "Now before the Passover." And what's about to happen with Jesus' passion and death is related to the Feast of Passover. And there have been a couple of other times in the Gospel when it referred to that. One was when Jesus went to Jerusalem the first time, and drove out the money changers from the temple. And then also in John 6, before the bread of life discourse, it was introduced by saying, now the time of Passover was near. Here we get Jesus' third Passover in the Gospel of John. And Jesus is sober because he's aware that it's about the time in which he's going to move out of this world and go to the Father. And so this begins really, the whole second part of the Gospel of John is the kind of poignant expression of Jesus' love for the disciples and of his last communications with them. It says, in fact, that having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And the way the Greek is written, it could mean he loved them to the last, right before he died, but it could also mean he loved them utterly, to the furthest point. And I think probably both senses are intended here. So what is about to unfold is an act of Jesus' love. So we get this interpretation of it. So then it says, he knew that the Father had put all things into his hands. So he is aware of a kind of fullness of power. That's odd for a guy who's about to be crucified, but he sort of knows that in some ways the authority has been given him to drive this, to move this in the way that he thinks is right, and then in some ways God is backing him up to make it happen. And he says, and that he had come from God and that he was going to God. This has been a constant theme of the Gospels, that Jesus is the one who comes from God and is going to God. So it's a repetition there. It says, knowing all this, with all this in his mind, the plenitude of power that is about to be his, that he's from God and going to God, what does he do? He lays aside his garments. He kind of strips himself. And it's a stripping that's symbolic as well as actual. It's a way of symbolizing what he did by coming into the world. You know, having, as it says in Philippians chapter 3, he who was in the form of God did not count equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he became obedient even to death on the cross. So that same idea of Philippians 2, of that hymn about Christ, is expressed in this action in which Jesus strips himself of his outer garments, takes a towel, ties it around rises from supper, takes a towel, puts it around his waist, pours water into a basin, and begins to wash the disciples' feet. Now, you know, washing feet isn't anything any of us would be very thrilled about doing, but in the ancient world it was even more significant. People didn't need to wash their feet because they walked on dusty roads with sandals that exposed their feet to dirt, so your feet could get pretty darn dirty. But it was also understood that the feet were the kind of lowest part of the person. It's still in the Middle East, you know. When they wanted to dishonor Saddam Hussein, you know, they stepped on, you know, his picture. You know, putting the feet on something. You know why Muslims, when they enter a mosque, they take their shoes off. The feet are sort of seen as somehow lower. But in Judaism, it was even understood that a free Israelite should not be obliged to wash somebody's feet. Only that was work fit for a slave. So here's Jesus, this exalted leader who had just been celebrated as king, marching into Jerusalem, you know, on the back of a donkey, and hailed as the king, the Messiah, the Christ. And he basically takes off his outer clothes, girds it, makes himself look like a slave in the way he dresses, bows down, and washes the feet of each of the disciples. An extraordinary act of self-abasement, and that's why Peter objects so strenuously. Lord, you're never going to wash my feet. I'm never going to permit you to do that. That's so totally out of order for the disciple to have his feet washed by the master, by the teacher, by the one who's the light of the world, the one who's the Messiah. You know, he can't take it. But Jesus says, I know you don't understand now, but later on you will. Peter still says, no way, you're never going to do this. And Jesus says, listen, you don't understand. If I don't wash you, you don't have any part in me. You need me to wash you. And there's something deeper there that we can see in the light of Jesus' death and resurrection. In the light of it, we know that Jesus is the one who washes every human being from sin, and that gets applied to us through the literal washing of baptism in which Jesus washes us. And that's what gives us, I think, a window on the meaning of the text when it says, the one who has bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, for he is completely clean. It speaks about the effects of baptism as completely cleansing us. But a rite isn't a guarantee. And even Jesus is right. Even the washing by Jesus doesn't mean everybody's clean, because he knew who was going to betray him. In other words, it's not a magical rite that turns a person into something different. It is Jesus doing something that we could never do for ourselves, but it's something that requires our consent, our acceptance, our faith, and our faithfulness. And so that's why Judas gets washed like the others, but he doesn't get clean. Okay, let's read the next verses, chapter 13, verses 12 to 17.
When he had washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, "Do you understand what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I had given you an example, that you also should do just as I have done to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them."
So, as with many of Jesus' teachings, there are two levels of meaning. On the one level, his washing the feet is a symbolic, prophetic gesture of what he's about to do. He's about to wash all who will accept it and cleanse us from the sin through his death on the cross, through this self-abasement. But on a second level, there's a practical teaching here for every disciple of Jesus. And then that message is, that as Jesus said, if I, your Lord and teacher, wash your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. Saying that this gives us a model of how we're to relate to others, with humility, with love, with service. He says a servant is not greater than master. I'm your master, so if I can do this, you can do this. And the bottom line is, it's saying there's no task too low for a Christian to do. You know, that's a pretty, for a disciple of Jesus to do. There's no task that's too humble, too abasing for a disciple to do. We should be willing to do it all. What he's saying. I have been reading a book by Jean Vanier, who is the founder of L'Arche, a community in France that takes care of severely handicapped people. And he wrote a commentary in the Gospel of John that's very poetic, very rich, very beautiful. But he offers a particular comment on this that I thought is good. He says, all groups, all societies are built on the model of a pyramid. At the top are the powerful, the rich, the intelligent. They are called to govern and guide. At the bottom are the immigrants, the slaves, the servants, people who are out of work or who have a mental illness or different forms of disabilities. They are excluded, marginalized. Here, Jesus is taking the place of a person at the bottom, the last place, the place of a slave. For Peter, this is impossible. Little does he realize that Jesus came to transform the model of society from a pyramid to a body, where each and every person has a place, whatever their abilities or disabilities, where each one is dependent upon the other. Each is called to fulfill a mission in the body of humanity and of the church. There is no last place. Jesus is revealing himself as the least one in society, the one who does the dirty jobs, the one who is in the last place, calls his followers to be attentive to the least in society. And then there's a second section where he talks about Mahatma Gandhi doing something like this. 233. Mahatma Gandhi was deeply influenced by the life and message of Jesus, especially the Sermon on the Mount and the washing of the feet. even when he had a great power as the leader of the country, he took the humblest place in the ashram where he lived. His role each day was to clean the toilets, a sign that he wanted to serve others. So we see here a model here for servant leadership that Jesus gives, that's taken up even by non-Christians and recognized for its kind of wonderful moral value. Okay, well, let's just pause here and take 10 minutes to talk about anything that strikes us about this passage. So I mentioned that one of the people, and now we're starting the second segment here, but that Jesus had said, you're not all clean, and now we're going to hear a little bit more about the one who wasn't clean. So, Jose, if you would read all the way down to verse 30, please.
I am not speaking of all of you. I know whom I have chosen, but the scripture will be fulfilled. He who ate my bread has lifted his heel against me. I am telling you this now before it takes place, that when it does take place, you may believe that I am. Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever receives the one I send receives me, and whoever receives me receives the one who sent me. After saying these things, Jesus was troubled in his spirit and testified, Truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me. The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he spoke. One of his disciples, whom Jesus loved, was reclining at table at Jesus' side. So Simon Peter motioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. So that disciple, leaning back against Jesus, said to him, Lord, who is it? Jesus answered, It is he whom I will give this morsel of bread when I have dipped it. So when he had dipped the morsel, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. Then after he had taken the morsel, Satan entered him. Jesus said to him, What you are going to do quickly. Now no one at the table knew why he said this to him. Some thought that because Judas had the money bag, Jesus was telling him, Buy what we need for the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. So after receiving the morsel of bread, he immediately went out, and it was night.
Here we see the fact that not everybody who gets called by Jesus accepts the call. And Jesus understands that this is in the plan of God. And he cites a text from Psalm 41, verse 9. Even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. So Jesus is saying, when this thing happens, when somebody betrays me, don't be surprised. I'm not surprised. It's in the plan of God. But nevertheless, Jesus is troubled in his spirit to think that one of these people that was really close to him, has done this. And so the disciples naturally say, well, hey, tell us the story, the inside story. So a couple of the disciples that were closest to Jesus, the one who's called the one whom Jesus loved, that will be mentioned 4 or 5 times in the gospel. And tradition says to us that it was John, the son of Zebedee. Others have some scholars have other theories about it. But whoever it is, it was somebody who was very close to Jesus. And so Peter says, hey, ask him. And so he leans and then Jesus says, the person I give this morsel to, because they, Middle Eastern way of eating, you might pick up some bread and you feed it to your neighbor and you dip it in the dish in the hummus, and so on. And that's kind of how they did things. And so Jesus gives him that. Now, another little background thing is that John's Gospel doesn't talk about the Eucharist at the Last Supper. The other 3 Gospels do. And this last meal that Jesus has with his disciples is the Eucharist. And they speak of Jesus saying, this is my body, this is my blood, and so on. So the possibility that the morsel that he gives them is part of this same bread that he's kind of announced as his body is there. And it's interesting because it says after he had taken the morsel, Satan entered into him. So it's kind of like, again, it's the rite does not determine the effect. It's the rite plus the response to baptism or to communion. And so a person who receives the body of the Lord, in the wrong way, isn't better off, is worse off. And here it says he takes the morsel and, Satan enters into him. We already heard about Judas a couple chapters before when it described the woman, Mary, who poured the ointment on Jesus' feet, the expensive ointment. And there it says Judas objected to that expenditure and it said it was because he was a thief. But here we see that for whatever reasons, whether it's money, whether it's other things, or a combination of motives, like probably it is for most people, Jesus knows who's going to do it. Jesus is troubled by it, grieved by it, but he knows that it's in God's plan and that he allows it to happen. And he says, what you're going to do quickly. In other words, he gives the man freedom to do what he's going to do. He doesn't resist. And the majority of the disciples don't know what's going on. Judas goes out, and then the evangelist says, and it was night. A kind of symbolic statement of darkness is kind of descending on the scene as Jesus is about to be betrayed and then judged and then condemned. So that there's yet more light, because Jesus is going to share in the coming chapters sort of some of the deep things he wants to share with his disciples before his departure. But there's a kind of shadow now that hangs over what's going on, because this betrayer is about to is doing his work, is at work. So we'll pause right there and take 5 minutes to share any kind of thoughts or reflections about Judas and about Jesus' response to him and about what's going on here. So we have now the third segment, which begins with chapter 13, verse 31, on a new commandment. So Jose, how about you read the rest of the chapter?
When he had gone out, Jesus said, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and glorify him at once. Little children, yet a little while I am with you. You will seek me, and just as I had said to the Jews, so now I always say to you, where I am going you cannot come. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus answered him, "Where I am going you cannot follow me now, but you will follow afterward." Peter said to him, "Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." Jesus answered, "Will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, the rooster will not crow till you have denied me 3 times.
So a couple thoughts here. First of all, does Peter love Jesus? Yeah, he really loves Jesus. There's no question about that. And so he's sincere when he says, "I will lay my life down for you." Just as we're sincere when we make various kind of promises to God. I won't sin again in this way. Or what is it? And we mean it, but we're weak and we're not as strong as we'd like to be. And what we need is the strength of God, in us to put to death what's earthly in us, to overcome sin, to express our love, to be consistent, to be able to die for Christ. I can say, as I would say, I would be very honored, pleased, glad to die for Christ. But believe me, I'm not going to presume like Paul or like Peter that there's a guarantee I'll follow through on. I need to pray pretty desperately for the grace, the courage, Kill me quick, please. Anyway, now stepping back to the earlier paragraph, which is where I'd like to focus. So Jesus says, after Judas has gone out, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him." And you may remember that in chapter 12, Jesus says, "Glorify your Son. Father, glorify your name." Then a voice from heaven said, "I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again." And here, Jesus says God is going to be glorified, and God will glorify the Son of Man. And so God is glorified by Jesus' death, and Jesus is glorified by his death and resurrection. So that's about what's going to happen. And then he gives this new commandment. And okay, you say, okay, a new commandment. All right, we got plenty of commandments, but okay, a new one. But what is it? It's love. Well, gosh, didn't we already have that one before? Like, love your neighbor as yourself? So somehow Jesus is distinguishing this new commandment from the old commandment to love your neighbor as yourself, which Jesus himself emphasized, but it was already in the Torah, in the Old Testament, in Leviticus chapter 19. It says, love your neighbor as yourself. You shall love your neighbor as yourself as a command. So here's something different. Jesus is speaking about a particular kind of love that's supposed to characterize the relationship of his disciples. And he says it in the context of this foot washing. So how is it different? I think in two respects. One is, it's different in that it's a higher standard of love. Rather than say, love your neighbor as yourself, he says, love one another as I have loved you. If I love my neighbor as myself, I give my neighbor equal to what I would give myself. That's good. That's really good. That's what the law said. That's still good. And Jesus emphasizes that as a command. But if you love your neighbor as Jesus loved us, you actually put your neighbor way ahead of yourself by laying down your life for that person. By really putting them above all your interests. You're not holding them, loving them the same way. You're putting them first in a radical way. That's a pretty powerful command. It raises the stakes to love our fellow disciples the way that Jesus loves us. We're to love them with that foot-washing spirit of putting them first. And then the second way in which this love is different is that it's to be a reciprocal love. Love one another as I have loved you. So in other words, there's a kind of communion, a kind of relationship between people who are that committed to one another that they will love one another with self-sacrificing love. That is willing to die for the other, is willing to lay down their life for another. That's essentially what it means to love one another. And so Jesus says, when you do this, people will see it, and they'll know that you're my disciples. It's a distinguishing mark of Christians, not just general charity, not even loving your neighbor as yourself, but loving those other people way more than yourself to the point of being willing to die, to lay down what's everything that would be of your own for the sake of that other person. That's a pretty high ideal, but that's what that Jesus summons us to. So that's the final segment here. Let's take a few minutes to share any reflections or questions or thoughts we have about it.
All right, guys. So we're gonna finish up, and thank you so much for being here for chapter 13. Next week, join Bible Brew again for chapter 14, believing in Jesus for who he is, the promise of God coming to live in us. So, see you next week.